Good morning. How are you today? Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm excited to be here for a number of reasons. Let's see, I've lived here in the Southern California region for over 30 years. I did my research, my PhD and master's at USC, and did it in urban and regional economics, which included a deep dive into the local economies. And here I get to have, as the chief economist of the LAEDC, I get to actually have the dream job that an urban economist who studied the LA region gets to have, which is to actually talk about this stuff on a regular basis to groups such as you. I enjoyed my years teaching economics in the Cal State system, but anybody who teaches university level stuff, and especially teaches principles courses that are prerequisites for some other program, know that you're not really appreciated when you're standing up there in front of those individuals, much as you want them to understand what you're talking about. But, here I've got a captive audience. You guys actually, with that introduction, how could you not hang on every word that I have to say? So I'm just thrilled to be here today. And I would like to thank the Pat Brown Institute for inviting me to participate. Thanks very much, Rafe. You seem to have disappeared, but thank you very much. This is a great event. We hear all the time about LA being Tinseltown, the capital of the entertainment industry, or the entertainment capital of the world, and yet there are some key industries here in Southern California and Los Angeles County in particular that are essential to our entire national economy, and one of those is the international trade and goods movement industry. You've already heard a few numbers recited today. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of how things are doing in terms of the overall economy, just for a couple minutes, because that's an important backdrop to how the ports are performing right now and what we're likely to see in the near future. So I can't really see what I'm showing you, but I'll just tell you that I'm going to talk a little bit, very little bit, about the U.S. and state economies. I think you need to know how we're doing right now. Then we'll talk about how the ports are doing. So let's see here. Yeah, okay. First off, let me ask you by show of hands, how many of you feel like we're out of the recession? Okay, and how many feel as though we're not quite out of the recession? Okay, so this graph shows that technically we are out of the recession. The recession was that big dip that you saw a few years ago, and since then we've seen both nationally and statewide job gains that are quite nice, okay? But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people don't feel as though the recession is over, or if it has, it just hasn't quite reached them personally, or reached their households, or reached their businesses, and so that's an important concern for all of us. I think we need to all be concerned about that. You should notice, though, that California, which is represented here by the black line, has outperformed the U.S. in recent years in terms of job gains, and as a result of that, its unemployment rate, which you can see here, which was once much higher than that of the U.S., is now very close. It's closing in on the U.S. unemployment rate. It's typically higher than the national unemployment rate, but the fact of the matter is that when you look at the numbers, these numbers tell us the basic progress that the economy has been making over the last several years. By these numbers, by these gauges, we're doing okay. We're not doing great, but we're doing okay. And yet the reality, or at least the perception, I should say, that so many people have is that indeed, maybe in their own personal situation, is not quite where they would like it to be. And so that continues to be a challenge, not just for us locally, but also statewide and nationally. Again, I said I'm going to only spend a couple of minutes here and talk about the national economy. You should know that over the next year we expect to see that the national economy will continue to grow at the same rate or a little bit faster than it has over the last couple of years. What that translates into, from our perspective, looking at the ports, is we should expect continued growth in import activity. And so you see almost 2.5% growth this year in GDP, a little bit more next year. We should see a pretty strong showing as far as the imports are concerned. What you don't see here is the international side of things, which of course drive exports. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that this shows the imports and the exports of goods, specifically of goods, into and out of the United States over the last several years. And it's measured in dollar terms. I can't see my slides up there, so let me just turn my attention here. So we were looking at somewhere over $2 trillion in imports over these last several years. You can see it's been on the rise, but this year you're looking at a slight dip. And then the green bars show exports, so we tend to have a trade deficit, and especially with respect to goods at the national level. We tend to have a trade deficit, so we've seen goods exports just above $1 trillion a year, close to $1.5 trillion a year, but for this year we expect a little bit of a decline. When we take a look in just a moment at the trade numbers for the ports themselves, you'll see that it is very much a reflection of what's happening nationally in these overall trade numbers. I'm going to go to this slide now, and the reason is I get a lot of questions about the ports and about trade, and one of the issues that has come up recently is the importance of China to our economy, to the goods movement part of our economy, and whether transitions that are happening in the country of China are going to lap up on our shores and have an impact one way or another, good or bad, on the U.S. economy and on the local ports. So you first have to look at this from the perspective of exports. So up here you see exports as a share of total GDP, and out of those goods exports, China is large, but it's still a small part of the total. And when you take, and this is only, what is that? I'm sorry, I can't see there. It's a little over 9%. When you slice and dice and you get to the part that China represents in the U.S. economy, it's a small fraction. So there are concerns about the Chinese transition from an industrializing, export-oriented economy to one that is more inward-oriented, more consumer-driven, and will that have an impact on the U.S. economy? The fact is the U.S. economy is still fairly insulated with respect to trade, and that these transitions that are going to be happening over the next several years, probably next several decades in China, will have some effect, but they're not going to have a dramatic effect on the overall picture for the U.S. economy and for its growth. Let's spend a few minutes talking about the local picture. So we're changing gears here for a moment. And you've heard this already from what was essentially the choir this morning, and we're going to have another choir here to talk about the ports in just a little bit. But these are very knowledgeable people, and international trade is a linchpin of the local economy. When we take a look at the overall economy, we divide industries. One way of looking at the overall economy is to divide industries into those that are called traded industries and those that serve the local population. You can see at the top of the list we've got international trade as one, entertainment is another, business services, knowledge creation and education is yet another, aerospace, so there's some components of manufacturing. These are all industries that produce something that we sell to somebody else outside the area, and through those sales we increase the size of the economic pie here in Southern California and Los Angeles County. So that's important. Those are essential industries to our future growth, right? Over on the other side, the right-hand side, those are very important industries as well. You've got healthcare, retail, leisure and hospitality. Who doesn't like to go to a nice restaurant, right? So those kinds of things are important to our quality of life here in Southern California, but they are in part made possible by the growth and expansion that occurs with those industries on the left side. So the international trade and goods movement industry is one of those key industries that drives growth in the local economy. You heard with the earlier panel, there are good things that accompany that. There also are challenges that accompany that. There are some areas of Southern California that are affected adversely. I really have to applaud those who participated in this morning, the first panel this morning, for really shedding so much light on so many different aspects of this industry. We'll continue to do that with the next panel that will follow. Okay. So the overall economy is growing. We're adding jobs in just about every industry here in the local, that is to say, Los Angeles County economy. We're expecting to add in the neighborhood of 100,000 jobs this year in LA County. as you can see there, we've added year over year about 85,000 jobs with a growth rate of about 2%. So the LA County's economy is adding jobs at about the same rate as the nation as a whole, 2% year over year, which is a little bit slower than the state as a whole, which is adding jobs at about a 3% rate. Notice that among those adding jobs, you have transportation and warehousing, as well as wholesale trade. So these are the two sectors that we track closely when we're studying the goods movement and international trade component of the local economy. Here's the picture for the two ports. You already heard about container activity, so the TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units. Those are what you're seeing here. So we're looking at the physical movement of these containers. The peak years were 2006 and 2007 for the twin ports. That's when we had in the neighborhood of 15.7 million containers passing through the ports. During the worst of the recession, you can see that port activity measured by containers dipped rather sharply, and then it came back. You look at last year. Last year, we really started to see the labor disputes and congestion issues arise in the tail end of last year, and even so, we turned in the third best year on record. So kudos to both ports for accomplishing that. And then at the beginning of the year, you heard a little bit earlier in the first panel, we had this perfect storm of congestion and labor dispute that wreaked havoc in the first couple of months of this year, caused a diversion of at least some activity to the East Coast ports. You shift forward to the present time, you can see some year-to-date numbers there that show that in terms of total activity, we're about even with last year. And a recent article that I read shows that we've pretty much recovered the activity that was diverted to the East Coast. So the world as we know it is coming back, into a sort of normal state of affairs. We'll talk a little bit later with the panel about why the West Coast ports and the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach really have achieved their preeminent position and how they can maintain that, or one would hope that they can maintain it going forward in the face of very stiff international and domestic competition. Just a few more slides to put the local ports into perspective. In terms of international container traffic, you see the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are at the top, among the top 5 as shown here. In terms of, you heard Stephen Chung mention earlier that the two ports account for 40% of the container activity coming into the United States. So that percentage, or 40% or more, has been pretty much the case for the last 10 years or so. And then the amount of employment that's associated with this industry, this is not an exact count, but it just shows you the trends of those two key industries that are very closely, these two industries that are very closely tied to port activity. And here in 2015, after a dip during the recession and recovery, we're seeing what will be record levels of jobs, both for transportation and warehousing, and for wholesale trade. Now, this is for Los Angeles County. You got to recognize that even though these ports are located here in Los Angeles County, they are regional assets. And this industry actually shows up in the adjacent counties as well. So here you can see employment distributed across Los Angeles County, which appears in blue. Orange County, which appears in red, and then you've got the Inland Empire and Ventura County. Look at the shift over time. You can see that over time, the share of employment here residing in Los Angeles County has declined. We've seen growth especially in the warehousing and distribution parts of this industry, shifting out to the Inland Empire where there is space, where they can build new warehouses that accommodate the 21st century way of doing business. And so we're not just talking about something that's affecting the immediate area around the ports or just Los Angeles County, but all of the Southern California region. And then, of course, these are national assets, as you heard just a few minutes ago. There are a few other metrics that we track when we take a look at how how the trade sector is doing in Los Angeles, and for several years running, the LA Customs District has led the nation in terms of the value of trade. So you heard a number earlier, cited $416 billion in two-way trade going through the ports. Sorry, not just going through the ports. LA Customs District includes a region that starts in Las Vegas and encompasses Ventura County as well as the five-county area. It does not include San Diego, but it's a huge region. And for many years running, it's been leading the nation in terms of the trade volume, two-way trade. So this isn't what is, especially on the export side, this is not what we make and sell. Okay, this is what passes through our customs districts. If we look at what we make and sell around the world, I'm sorry, let me see. Maybe I missed that. Let me back up for a second. I'm missing a slide, but if you look at what we make and sell, I guess I'll get to that in a little bit. There are some things that we make locally and we sell to the rest of the world, but what you're looking at here is just what the total amount of trade that passes through our ports. Here's a quick look at our top trading partners, top sources of imports, with China in the lead. We have about a 4-to-1 relationship between what we import from China and what we export. And these are the categories of things, the top categories of things that we import. And now take a look at the categories of things that we export, and you'll see a great deal of similarity between the two. Okay? So these are imports and exports. Okay? The stuff that we produce and export, you probably already know. We make a lot of transportation equipment, aircraft and parts, things like that, that are produced and sold here locally. Royalties from film and music. So when you think about exports, don't forget that there are services that are exported as well. And so one of the largest sources of export revenues for the Southern California region is actually in the form of the royalties that come back from the intellectual property, the television shows, movies, and things like that that are broadcast and sold abroad. And then you also have petroleum products and precision instruments. I think you look at this list and you have to acknowledge that the Los Angeles County and Southern California region is an incredibly diverse economy that produces all sorts of things, many of which have direct links to the ports. Now, we typically talk about this discussion on the ports in the context of moving goods here into Los Angeles or into the ports and then shipping them or directing them to the rest of the country. But do keep in mind we have 10 million people here in Los Angeles County, 18 million people in the region. We have a huge market locally that these ports and the entire sort of transportation complex supports, in addition to supporting the movement of goods to the rest of the country. So that's one thing that we often overlook when we have these discussions of the ports. A great deal of what lands in the ports here actually stays local. So we're serving the local population in addition to the nation as a whole. Here's a quick rundown on some of the challenges and opportunities that I have seen in my experience in studying the ports. We have competition here, not just with the West Coast ports. We'll talk a little bit more about the challenge that the Panama Canal expansion may bring to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. The ports on the Atlantic side of the country would very much like to get a bigger piece of the action. So there's some competition that our ports face. We'll talk about how they have risen to the occasion. There's very limited industrial space in the near vicinity of ports. So you heard in the previous panel about something called SCIG, the Southern California International Gateway, right? It's one of many areas where containers need to be moved. They need to be shifted from one mode to another. And the problem is that you've got such a built-out area in the immediate vicinity of the ports, it's very difficult to find space for that. In addition, that space is in competition, not just for those activities, but for manufacturing and other kinds of activities. So that's a real challenge for the ports themselves and the operators there. There's a labor automation trade-off that we'll talk about with our panelists in just a few moments. We heard some of the comments about freeway congestion as well as the pollution externalities that arise because, you know, we're moving the nation's goods to other points, and as a result of that, many of our communities are adversely affected. And then there's port-related pollution. So I've also identified some opportunities here that tie in with many of those, and we'll talk about those in just a few minutes.